Well, Curtis, why don't you tell us a bit about your career in public transit and how you took the helm as COTA's President and Chief Executive Officer?
Well, Doug, like so many of my colleagues in the industry, I never planned a career in public transit. Like most of the folks I met in the industry, I sort of stumbled into transit. And like many of them, I worked in a few other capacities before becoming CEO. But I think that's where the similarities really end. For me, I came out of a totally unrelated industry. I'm an attorney. I spent about half my career before joining COTA in traditional practice of law and about half in various management and leadership roles. Among those were Corporations Counsel for the Secretary of State of Ohio, and held several positions in the Ohio Department of Commerce before coming to the Central Ohio Transit Authority. How I became the President and CEO, I really think it's just a matter of doing great work in each of the positions I held prior to becoming CEO. The story I like to tell about it, though, is my predecessor, Bill Loda, who, by the way, just passed away, and it's a tremendous loss for COTA and our community.
Yeah, I saw that. It really is sad. He's a great guy.
We're sad to have lost him at such an early age. He was only 77, and these days that's early. But anyway, Bill was great at promoting people, and I don't mean promoting from one level or one position to the next, but touting the value of people within this organization, mentoring people. And he was hired for a short term. First contract was 18 months, but stayed 7.5 years because he fell in love with public transit, like most of us do when we get into this industry. He really, over the course of about 3 or 4 years, convinced me that if he were looking inside COTA, that I was probably the best person inside COTA to succeed him. And it was his way of operating. And when he announced that he was leaving about 3 years before he actually left, the board did all that they could do to get him to stay longer, and really never focused on hiring a successor until he made a deal with him. And his deal was, I'll stay longer if you will consider one internal candidate of my choosing, of his choosing, as they conducted their actual search for his successor. And long story short, I was that person he chose, and then the board selected me as after their national search as the best candidate for the position.
Well, I'm sure you agree with me, Curtis, that you were fortunate to have Bill as a mentor.
Yeah.
Many CEOs I've worked with over the years have not been so fortunate, which makes it a lot more difficult. Well, as you know, there's pretty universal agreement in the public and nonprofit sectors that building a strong partnership with the board has to be a top CEO priority if you're going to succeed on the job. How well prepared were you when you took the top spot to build a strong partnership with your new board? And looking back, what did you really have to learn on the job about CEO board partnership building?
Well, Doug, I thought I was pretty well prepared initially, but later realized that I wasn't. And I realized that our leadership team was also unprepared in terms of building a strong relationship with our board of trustees. You know, I ascended to the CEO role after about 13 years at COTA. And over that entire time, I worked pretty closely with our board of trustees in various capacities, including as vice president and general counsel. And several of the members of the board that I inherited, or maybe they inherited me, but I considered those trustees close colleagues and even friends. And that was the good part. there were some strong and very long-serving trustees on the board at that time who were well respected in the community and with whom I built great relationships with over those years. We had a comfort level with one another, and I guess I would call it confidence and trust in one another. And here comes the conjunction. But within a couple of years, we experienced some rapid turnover on our board of trustees. We've got 13 board members, or 13 seats on our board, and at one point, more than 50% of the trustees had less than 1 year of experience because of rapid turnovers. Those long-standing board members, all for good reasons, didn't re-up, didn't get reappointed, didn't seek reappointment. But it resulted in us having a board that was pretty much all novices. And I learned a couple of things about what we were doing here at COTA and our relationship, staff's relationship, the CEO's relationship to this new board. I realized that our orientation and onboarding process might have been good when we were experiencing some small incremental changes from year to year in our board composition. You'd have a couple people roll off, and you'd be dealing with a couple of new people. But the orientation and onboarding that we were using was not well suited for coalescing a large group of new trustees around the mission and vision of the organization. I also realized that providing the right level of detailed communication to bring this relatively inexperienced majority up to speed on the vision and mission, and even up to speed on specific projects that the former board had sanctioned, while at the same time ensuring that the board function at the governance level was a delicate balance, and it posed a lot of challenges for me and my leadership team. And honestly, it were challenges that we didn't handle very well. Needless to say, after perhaps too long, I finally reached out and brought in some support and some great assistance to help refocus our leadership team, refocus our board on our respective goals, and really on our appropriate roles. The board is responsible for governance, and the staff is responsible for management and day-to-day operations. And we really need to get refocused on that. And after we struggled with that for much too long, we brought in some outside support to move us through a transition back to our appropriate roles and responsibilities.
Great. Now, looking back on your years as president and CEO of COTA, what's the most satisfying to you in your CEOship?
This has been a great opportunity for me, Doug. I have loved about 98.5% of the minutes. I would say every minute, but about 98.5% of the minutes that I've spent in this role. And even that other 1.5% of the time, it wasn't bad. It was just very difficult times and difficult issues, things that come with the territory. But I think in the leadership role as the CEO of this transit agency, the thing that I enjoyed most is kind of twofold. The CEO position can have a major impact in developing policy and creating corporate and business support for public transit. But at the same time, being CEO here placed me in a position that allowed me to be an advocate for our grassroots community, ensuring that, the practical needs of our transit-dependent and our transit-reliant customers. And I make a distinction there. Transit-dependent people, I look at transit-dependent and use that term when I'm talking about people who don't have a lot of choices, need public transportation to get around. And transit-reliant are folks like me. I have a car. My wife has a car. My daughter has a car. And but I rely on public transit because it gets me where I need to go. So this position has helped me to make sure that the practical needs of our transit-dependent and transit-reliant customers are part of the discussion with our corporate leaders and our political policymakers. If we've got time, I'd like to share maybe one or two stories with you. One is when I came in as CEO, I wanted to reach out to that corporate community. My predecessor was a well-respected member of the business community for 37 years with American Electric Power. That's based right here in Columbus, and he could get in any door that he wanted in the corporate sector in this community. I didn't have that luxury, and I had to find a way to be able to engage that group. So I announced that I was going to ride the bus with 30 business leaders, with 100 business and community leaders in 2013. And I got a couple of folks in town who were widely known corporate leaders, bankers, heads of major nonprofit organizations in the community to go on a ride with me. Now, actually, I went on a ride with them. I took them on the bus where they needed to go, and not to waste their time with a field trip with me, but to give them an opportunity to see how COTA works and how COTA can work for them, how COTA does work every day for people getting from place to place, places they need to go. And I got folks who started calling me as a result of publicizing these first few rides. And I made it a point when they called and asked, can I ride with Curtis? The answer was always no. But Curtis wants to ride with you, was my response. And that really, I did reach 100 trips on December 28th of 2013, just under the wire. And it really opened doors, got me into doors, talking to major CEOs throughout our community that I would have never been able to talk to otherwise.
What a great idea.
And so that gave me that first contact with a lot of the business leaders that helped me when I needed to pick up the phone and call someone for support or advice, or to even offer them assistance where COTA could be of assistance to them. So that was one of the things that I really loved about this job. I was challenged with being able to build relationships with those major CEOs in our community, but came up with a creative way to get their attention and even have some of them reach out and say, hey, I'd like to ride with Curtis. The other thing, though, was a story that covers some folks on the other end of the socioeconomic spectrum, if you will, just some grassroots people. One day I was having trouble, and this job, any CEO will tell you, sometimes the battles you fight are inside the walls of the organization. And I was going through some fairly tough discussions with some of our planners, some of the other folks here at COTA about how we should be deploying our service, who we should be taking care of and making sure get first priority with our service, people who really need us. And one day sitting at my desk, and I just had enough. And I left work early. I was going back to my car. I was on the bus heading back to the park and ride, and thought about all the errands I needed to run. And the last errand that I was going to run before going on home put me about a half a mile away from the location of a public meeting that was going on that afternoon or that evening. Long story short, I stopped at that public meeting. Even though I was feeling pretty bad, I just wanted to get away from all things COTA for a while. But I went on to that meeting. Something told me to go to that meeting, and I went. And in the meeting, we were talking about one of the projects that we were working on. I can't remember if it was the Next Gen or the Bus Rapid Transit project. And, well-designed agenda, and we're moving through the agenda, and I'm sitting there just listening, observing. I had introduced myself at the beginning of the meeting with everybody else in the room, but there were about 40 people in this room, and only about 4 or 5 COTA people. And a lady decided she just had enough. She was going to dictate what was happening the rest of the meeting, and she interjected and said, you know, you've been talking about all the great things that are happening in this community, great things that COTA is doing. You've been talking about that, and you're going to be coming back to the voters soon, asking for a renewal of the sales tax levy, and here's what we want. We want a refund on the sales taxes that we've already paid because you're not providing the service that we need. We want to just be able to get to all of those great places that you're talking about that are growing and booming and vibrant places for people to go in our community, but we can't even get to those other parts of our community because COTA isn't providing the service to get there. And you would think that, you know, I went into the meeting kind of in a bad mood from the day, but the more this lady talked, the better I felt, because she was saying the same thing to me as I had been saying to our staff. We cannot let the service that we provide create islands, or better yet, create desert islands where communities are locked out of opportunity here in Central Ohio, right here in Columbus, because of a lack of a good transit connection to other parts of the community. We talk about, you know, food deserts where there are no grocery stores. But this lady was talking about, we'd just like to come downtown and ride on that great new service you call C-Bus. But we can't even get downtown during certain parts of the day because you don't provide enough service for us. So this lady was not really complaining that. She really started off her statement by saying COTA is totally worthless. And then she started giving specifics. But she wasn't really saying that COTA was worthless. She was saying, we need you to hear us. And we need you to advocate for us. And we want you to hear what our needs are. And, you know, I left that meeting more uplifted and rejuvenated than I had been in a while. And it reminded me that, you know, my role is to make sure that voices like those are heard and that I'm carrying that message for people in our community. So those kind of things are the things that are most satisfying to me, that I can represent people in this community who have a need, and we're providing service that keeps people connected in this community in so many ways, to jobs, to just enjoying the aspects of life that so many of us take for granted.
You know, it's obvious, Curtis, you've loved being CEO of the Central Ohio Transit Authority. But some aspects of the job, heading a large and very complex organization must have been pretty challenging. What aspects did you find most challenging?
Two things: politics and personnel. Any CEO knows that there's politics involved in jobs like these, but and some of the politics are natural, necessary to get things done, and some of it is just unnecessary when you have to deal with people who think their personality is bigger than the office they hold. And without going into details and giving you a story about any of that, I'll just say politics where it's not necessary, because people like to throw their weight around or throw the weight of their office around, is unnecessarily challenging. We shouldn't have to deal with those kind of challenges. On the personnel part of it, firing people is always tough. If you ever get to the point where you like to fire people, gosh, I'm not sure I'd want you on my leadership team if you liked firing people.
Yeah, I think if you love firing people, maybe some sort of therapy would be in order, right?
I think so. It's tough, but sometimes you've got to make some tough decisions. And, we're so much in a people business, but you've got to have the right people. And you've got to be able to and willing to make decisions when it comes to people that make sure you've got the right personnel in the right places to get the job done. And so those are the two challenges always for me, politics and personnel.
Mm. Now, I'm going to put you on the spot a little with my closing question, Curtis, and you have the right not to respond, of course, but knowing you, I'm sure you will. Looking back over your years as CEO of COTA, is there a decision or an action you took as CEO that you really regret now, but that taught you a valuable lesson? Is there something you can think of that was what you might call a painful teaching moment for you?
Doug, I'm not really sure I can think of a singular decision that I've made or a single action I've taken that I can really say that I regret. Now, don't misunderstand me. I'm the first to admit that I've made probably more than my fair share of mistakes. But because I've always tried to do the right thing for the right reason, I can't really say necessarily that I regret any singular action or decision. But let me think about this. I guess I could say that I've regretted from time to time speaking too soon on matters being discussed with my leadership team. Being able to cut to the chase and give advice and counsel is a valuable asset as an attorney. It's not always good as a CEO. And, I've had to develop some patience to allow and perhaps even encourage input from others before I've weighed in on a matter. More often than not, when the CEO speaks, most people around the table assume, well, he's spoken, the decision is made.
Mm-hmm.
And I have had to work hard to resist being the first to answer a question when it's put on the table. And what's happened when I've done that, people disengage. They think, well, Curtis wants this, the CEO has spoken, and I think some of most of the members of my leadership team, my current leadership team, know that by this time, having worked with them for a number of years, they know that even when Curtis blurts out the first answer and says, here's what I think about that, Curtis usually will listen and engage in the discussion thereafter. And Curtis's initial statements and opinions aren't necessarily the direction we end up going in. But it's hard for people to get used to the fact that the CEO is going to give the first response and then assume that they're going to then engage with the CEO in conversation thereafter. So I've had to really bite my tongue just because of my habit of being, as an attorney, it's a great asset to be able to say, I know the answer to that, or here's the direction and advice and counsel that I would give in this matter. Because when acting as CEO, that doesn't work very well. So, in terms of how I operate, I've regretted operating in ways that I guess kind of stifle people's input and their willingness to participate and engage and get us to the best solution for a problem or the best outcome that we could possibly get to.
I think you'd agree that hold thy tongue would be valuable counsel for any CEO, right?
Oh yeah, and I've come out of meetings. I've come out of meetings with a sore tongue sometimes, just biting my tongue.
Well, Curtis, I really appreciate you taking the time to share some highlights from your very distinguished tenure as President and Chief Executive Officer of COTA, and I wish you well as your professional journey continues post-COTA. Take care. Have a nice evening.
Thanks, Doug. It's been my pleasure to talk to you, and it's been a great opportunity and pleasure to serve.